Alright, the next game I want to talk about is Soulstone Survivors. Soulstone Survivors is one of the other games that caught my attention after Vampire Survivors took off, and this is by far my favorite survivor roguelike. Similar to Vampire Survivors in many ways, but this one takes a different approach to visuals and aesthetic, which allows for a few other things that push this above Vampire Survivors for me. The isometric art style, flashy effects, and variety in upgrades make Soulstone Survivors a great time for any fan of this genre, and while I think combat in Soulstone Survivors is excellent, I chose to wait on making this video until the most recent major update was released that tackles the progression side of things, and holy shit, they did not let me down, so let's just dive straight in. When it comes to the game modes and ultimate goal within Soulstone Survivors, it's similar to others in the genre. You'll survive a stage to achieve multiple different things, one of the biggest being leveling up each class to unlock new abilities, runes, and weapons for it to utilize, and with the recent update, half of the classes received their own individual skill tree for you to progress through, with the others coming in the next update. I'll talk about the other forms of progression later, but for now, the other main two are of course completing achievements for unlocks and increasing the difficulty with each successful run. Rest assured, there are a lot of goals to keep you occupied here. Soulstone Survivors has a couple different game modes you can choose from at the end of a run. Endless mode, which is what you would expect, and then Overlord mode is a mode where you'll just fight increasingly more bosses with each stage that you complete. The movement and aim mechanics in Soulstone Survivors are on the more engaging side, with the ability to dash and aim, both of which, at least from my playtime, are important to your run and valuable skills to improve. They did add an auto aim feature in the most recent update, but keep in mind that it might not be as useful as in other games. Soulstone Survivors movement feels good to begin with and becomes even more satisfying as you increase your speed or add extra dashes, and when the difficulty stacks up, eventually you'll be playing it like a bullet hell, dodging red circles on the ground and large ability radiuses from the big bosses. Positioning, movement speed, and the use of your dash will totally determine success in your runs. In terms of feel, I'm actually kind of here or there about movement in Soulstone Survivors. Sometimes it feels mechanically satisfying and other times it feels slow or weighed down or just not rewarding enough, which is funny given that you have a lot of agency over your movement. And there is momentum in movement too, with small acceleration and deceleration time, even if you have high movement speed. In a similar vein, sometimes aiming ability will result in a health bar being chunked, and other times it feels like nothing happens. So it's just something to keep in mind and an interesting little tidbit about the movement and aim mechanics in Soulstone Survivors. When it comes to combat and sound design, despite movement being hit or miss for me personally, combat is where Soulstone Survivors really excels. First, the abilities that you choose, whether active or passive, all make a difference in combat, and you feel it if you build correctly too. Not only that, but the abilities do require you to think about what you want and how to build, as each ability has traits or debuffs that you can upgrade later in the run. And as I said, some are aimed, which makes the health bars going down on the enemies feel like a skill-based affair, and it adds to the feel of combat. A lot of the abilities look and feel like they don't belong in a survivor-like because of how they're done, with an emphasis on skill shots or positioning yourself correctly. One of the reasons I like the combat and in-run progression in this game is because it has much more of an action RPG feel than a survivor roguelike feel, which is personally something that I like a lot more, and what adds more to that experience is how the abilities and effects all look. The development team have gone through real lengths to make sure every upgrade looks great, and because of that, you feel so much more powerful as you pick them up. It is a huge addition to combat to have them look and feel as great as they do, but as good as combat is, the sound design isn't really there for me, so I'll talk about that later in the negative section. Progression and replayability are where Soulstone Survivors shines. I briefly mentioned in-run progression, but to touch on it again, it feels really good and the power creep is well done if you build correctly. The upgrades offered have good variety and versatility, but for now, I'd rather focus on the meta progression because that is where Soulstone Survivors shines the most, especially after this recent update. Each class has a level that you'll continuously increase into the hundreds as you play more on that class. This is already a motivating factor, knowing that you'll be progressing the class you're on no matter how deep into the game you go. Each class has a few unique weapons that are crafted at the blacksmith with materials that you find on different maps, the materials becoming more valuable on higher difficulties. There is a skill tree with a decent amount of general upgrades to help you in your runs, purchased with currency and crystals, and then of course, there are achievements of which unlock new abilities for you to use, but more importantly, runes, a few of which you can select for your run that will decide the build you're going for or just further increase your class's strengths, and there is a lot of these to be unlocked. But that's not all. With the most recent Path of Ascension update, they added fleshed out skill trees for each class, half of them available at the moment for you to invest all the resources that you've saved up straight into them. On top of that, however, these skill trees provide unique abilities and runes for each class to use. For example, the Archer utilizes a Panther to ride on, giving the Archer buffs, and for the devs to go all out, not only giving us more meta progression, but to top it off with unique abilities for each class, really says a lot and adds so much to the replayability of Soulstone Survivors. For me, there are only a few negatives with Soulstone Survivors. points. First, the sound design I just don't think is here. Compared to Vampire Survivors, Brotato, and the other ones that I've talked about, there just aren't enough sounds to tell me whether I'm killing lots of things or not. Visually, it's spectacular, but the audio just isn't there for me. Now, I don't have the best PC, but performance is an issue for me with lots happening on screen. I had to turn down the effects because of it in a lot of the footage, but just be aware that if you have a lower end PC that it might dip below 60 to 30, because that's what happens with me, especially on higher difficulties with more needing to be rendered. Again, even on the lower settings and the opacity turned down quite a bit, it still struggles. But man, overall, Soulstone Survivors is such a solid addition to the genre, and the developers continue to work to make sure that it stays that way. It's my personal favorite out of all of them, and I'm confident that if you haven't tried it yet, it might just become yours too. Progression is at a peak here, and while sound design might not be a strong point, combat is spectacular regardless. This is one that I can highly recommend.